We're all think alike, no one thinks very much. So said Walter Lippmann, one of the 20th century America's greatest journalists and public intellectuals. Now, someone who subscribes to that mindset is Niall Ferguson. He is, without doubt, one of the world's greatest and most prolific historians and public intellectuals of modern times. Niall, how do you reconcile your economic liberalism with your sympathies for Trump's tariffs?
China doesn't do free trade. How many times do we have to say this?
Isn't it true you did support the invasion, though?
Remember, you're confusing two completely different things, Tom.
No,
let me finish. Yeah. Either you accept that we created new norms after World War II or not. If you want to go back to the 1930s, be my guest.
G'day, Niall. Welcome back to CIS.
Great to be back.
Now, you don't like groupthink, do you? Tell us why.
I think I'm allergic to groupthink. I don't think I've ever been comfortable in a room full of people agreeing. My overwhelming impulse when I'm in that situation is to disagree. Not that I'm disagreeable. I think that's partly growing up in Glasgow, where even a family Christmas dinner would tend to descend into a bitter political disagreement. That was the kind of world I grew up in. But of course, there's a good intellectual reason for being wary of groupthink. The idea of groupthink, in fact, became widely understood in the 1960s in the wake of the escalation in Vietnam. And it was argued that one reason that the United States had got bogged down in Vietnam was that there was groupthink. All these Harvard-educated people around Lyndon B. Johnson,
the best and the brightest,
had succumbed to groupthink. So there are good historical reasons for avoiding groupthink.
Do you prefer polarization to groupthink?
Well, polarization is currently very out of fashion. In fact, if you want to say there's something wrong with America, the second sentence goes like this, because we've never been so polarized. And I hear this every other day. It's a typical way in which people think about the US election. But my observation is, firstly, that polarization is a feature, not a bug of American politics. We're no more polarized right now than, say, in the late 1940s, to say nothing of the Civil War in the 19th century. But in any case, what worries me is not when there's polarization in American politics. It's when there's agreement, when there's a bipartisan consensus on something. It's usually a reason to be skeptical. For example, in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, it didn't take long for a bipartisan consensus to form that the United States needed to take action against Saddam Hussein because of weapons of mass destruction, which turned out not to exist.
I was just going to say, though, on the war on terror, isn't it true that you did reflect that intoxicating conventional wisdom about the US interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, all ventures that the consensus now is were misbegotten ventures?
If you read my book, Colossus, its subtitle in the first edition was The Price of America's Empire. The argument of that book, which was written as the US was preparing to invade Iraq, was that the United States was going to fail its empire because of three deficits. The manpower deficit, because Americans really do not want to go and live in Mesopotamia or Afghanistan. The fiscal deficit, because the United States already had an unsustainable fiscal policy. And the attention deficit, because American voters lose interest in foreign wars about 4 years in. So the book Colossus was actually highly skeptical about the project that the neoconservatives launched in 2003. And I think I was vindicated by subsequent events.
The main argument against the Iraq invasion, it was a minority view. I mean, if you read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the major American publications, it was very hard to read the counter-argument to the war. But the main argument was made by the likes of John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. Mearsheimer, a past guest at CIS, and the argument was that the threat that Saddam posed could have been contained and deterred the way it had been since the previous Gulf War. Naval blockade, no-fly zone, the sanctions kept Saddam in his box. And if you keep him, if you bring him out of the box and launch a preemptive strike, you're going to bring about all these age-old sectarian tensions. But hardly anyone listened to Professor Mearsheimer.
And in a way, I don't think that was the clinching argument. The argument that almost nobody made at that time was that Iran would be the principal beneficiary of the overthrow of Saddam. Not even Henry Kissinger made that argument, which is quite surprising considering that he had a pretty good understanding of the regional balance of power. But I look back on my commentary at the time, and my big mistake was not to see that Iran would benefit hugely and that that was the best argument against overthrowing Saddam. My argument at the time was, hey, if you want to do empire, this is how you do it. And I'd just written a book about the British Empire. And I said, if you're going to go into these countries, you need to understand that this is going to take decades and it will cost a lot of money and men, as long as you understand that's what you're getting into. But of course, Don Rumsfeld thought it could all be done in about 5 minutes with about 10,000 men.
I take that point, and it is certainly true that official Washington did downplay those ethnic and sectarian tensions that rose to the surface, particularly the Shia Islamic faith, which of course is the majority sect in Iraq, and of course they're more likely to be sympathetic to Shia Iran. But isn't it true you did support the invasion, though?
Now, my argument at the time was, if you're going to do this, you need to learn from history. One of the things I remember arguing was, remember, when the British did this, there was an insurgency about a year in. You better be ready for that. So I actually wrote a piece strongly urging the British government not to get involved, because it was clear that there were really high risks and there was no obvious payoff for Tony Blair, who was then Prime Minister, in getting involved. Now, those debates back in 2002, 2003 are more than 20 years old. And people tend to forget that my position was one of skepticism about the neoconservative position.
Because of the danger of unintended consequences.
Well, I think it was more that there was no likelihood that the United States would be more successful in Iraq than it had been in Vietnam. And that analogy is one of the ones I explore in the book Colossus.
One of the orthodoxies, of course, leading up to that period was that democracy was an export commodity. Did you subscribe to that view?
No, I did not. In fact, I'd written a book before the Colossus called The Cash Nexus, which tried to argue that there were all kinds of problems with the notion that democracy was a one-size-fits-all institutional template. So I was highly skeptical about the idea that you could turn Iraq into a democracy. I still remember vividly, before the invasion, being in Washington and having a conversation with a young lady who was working for the US government, and I asked her what her vision was of post-Saddam Iraq. And she said that post-communist Poland was the kind of model that they were thinking of. And I remember looking at her and thinking, have you ever been to the Middle East? That you could imagine Poland was the template? So my experience at that time was one of kind of mounting incredulity that Americans were embarking on this enterprise with almost no knowledge of what they were getting into. I wrote a piece for the New York Times Magazine, of all things, pointing out that the United States had fantastically little good knowledge in its universities of the Middle East. They had hardly any people who spoke and wrote Arabic. So they went into an imperial project without the kind of resources and skills that Britain had had 100 years before. And Britain had struggled. One of the arguments I made at that time was that if you just looked at Britain's attempt to run Iraq after World War I, the ratio of British troops to Iraqis was really pretty high. By that time in 2003 rather, the Iraqi population was far larger than it had been in 1920. So I was very skeptical that this would be a successful enterprise.
Let's fast forward 20 years to the Ukraine crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. And again, the overwhelming consensus, the groupthink, certainly across the Western world, in the United States, Britain and Australia, was that this was unprovoked aggression by Putin, and that the West is absolutely right to support Ukraine as long as it takes, I think they were the words of both Joe Biden and Boris Johnson, as long as it takes to defeat Russia. You subscribe to that consensus view. Why?
Well, hang on. Let's just get the record straight. I've been to Ukraine every year for the last 13 years. And in 2021, the year before the invasion, I pointed out in Kyiv that it was highly likely that Putin was going to escalate his invasion. Remember, he already invaded in 2014, and we did next to nothing. So I warned consistently that there was going to be an invasion. In the first week of January 2022, my opening column of the year began, "War is coming," and I tried my best to argue that we were failing to deter Putin. And we did fail to deter Putin. What happened was a chronic failure of deterrence. I say chronic because the Biden administration has been bad at deterrence pretty much all around the world, but this is the most striking example. So I think in the groupthink you're talking about, I was
But the groupthink is that it was unprovoked aggression by Putin. You'd agree with that?
Well, Putin has violated the sovereignty of Ukraine.
No question.
That is a violation of international law in the same way that Saddam Hussein violated Kuwait's sovereignty when he invaded it in 1990. So if you think that we were right to throw Iraq out of Kuwait, I don't see how you could think it would be okay for Putin to annex all or part of Ukraine.
But do great powers play by special rules? I mean, you're an historian of great power politics. Don't great powers play hardball to protect vital strategic interests in their sphere of influence or their near abroad? And isn't that precisely what Putin did? He saw NATO coming, the threat of NATO expansion into Ukraine. That is a red line for not just Putin, but for the Russian body politic.
You have been reading too much John Mears. I mean, of course, if you want to go back to the 1930s, my time machine awaits you, and good luck. But the whole point of the way in which the international system was reformed after two ghastly world wars was that there was no forcible changes in national sovereignty permitted. And there wasn't, in Europe, any attempt of this sort until Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So either you accept that we created new norms after World War II or not. If you want to go back to the 1930s, be my guest.
But what did the United States do in communist Cuba in the early 60s?
Well, communist Cuba was a revolution. The United States tried to overturn that revolution unsuccessfully, and Cuba
but they invaded
is still
a sovereign state.
United States was trying to overturn the Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro. I'm not saying that it was good. I'm not saying that it was bad, but that was a different thing from annexing Cuba. Remember, you're confusing two completely different things, Tom.
No,
let me finish.
Yep.
Because what Putin said in July of 2021 was that there was a historic unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people, and Ukraine had no legitimacy to be an independent state. His goal in February of 2022 was to annex Ukraine. He has annexed parts of Ukraine. That is against international law. If you accept that that's okay, what will he do next? And are you simply going to allow the rule of the mighty to determine where borders are drawn in our world? If you want to do that, the 1930s are waiting to welcome you back.
How would Putin invade and conquer and occupy all of Ukraine, which is a much larger country than Poland, with only 190,000 troops, when Hitler went into Western Poland with 1.4 million troops? How on earth could Putin and Russia conquer and occupy a country such a landmass with limited forces?
Well, the CIA thought he was going to achieve it because they expected the Zelensky government to fall and offered Volodymyr Zelensky a plane ticket out of Ukraine. To everybody's amazement, including, I imagine, yours, because I suspect you haven't been to Ukraine, the Ukrainians fought back, successfully defeated the Russian invasion of Kyiv, drove the Russians back to Donbass, and have fought for the last 2.5 years to prevent their country being consumed by Russian imperialism. I'm with the Ukrainians. And I think any person who believes in the idea of a free world in which independent democracies can be defended against imperial invasions would be on the Ukrainian side too.
But what about in early April of 2022, so 6 weeks after the invasion, there were peace talks in Istanbul, overseen by both the Turks and the Israelis, led by the former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, and they came very close to a deal where Russia and the Ukrainians would recognise that Russia would control the 7% of the Donbass that they had, mainly from the 2014-2015 intervention, plus Crimea, and in exchange, Ukraine would have to be neutral. That is, it would not be part of NATO. They came very close to that deal, and then Boris Johnson and Joe Biden came to the Ukrainian rescue and said, we will support you for as long as it takes. Now, 2 years later, Ukraine has lost not just 7%, but 20%. Haven't we led the Ukrainians down the primrose path?
Well, I was highly critical of the decision to prolong the war on the ground that Ukraine was unlikely to prevail in a long war, and in my published writings in 2022, I warned against the cynical calculation in Washington that prolonging the war was smart because the Ukrainians were degrading, quote unquote, the Russian military machine. This has played into the hands not only of Russia but also of China. The correct time to end the war was early. That's what you do when a small power is threatened by a really large power.
April 2022?
Or later, actually, the best time was when the Russians were on the run outside Kharkiv and Kherson. We forget now that the Russians were close to losing the war in late 2022, and it was another terrific mistake of American policy not to equip the Ukrainians with the means to finish the Russian army, which was in full flight from the gates of Kharkiv and Kherson. So I think terrible mistakes have been made by the Biden administration, and I've tried in my writings to point them out.
Another groupthink, of course, in international relations in the post-Cold War era, certainly throughout the 1990s and 2000s and much of the 2010s, and we in Australia subscribed to this view, was that we should engage with mainland China, that is communist China. The more Western engagement there was with China, the more likely it would be, in the words of Bob Zellick, a responsible stakeholder in the world. This was the overwhelming conventional wisdom across Europe, North America, Australasia. In retrospect, was the conventional wisdom wrong? Haven't we just been feeding the beast?
Well, there was a mistake, and I think it was made in 2001, and that was to admit China to the World Trade Organization and then not to enforce its rules, in effect to give China a special deal. And it was from that point that China's economic growth and its catch-up really accelerated. Now, why it was that Western elites thought there would be no downside to allowing China to have this asymmetrical advantage in international trade, future historians will try to fathom. But that's a good example of a bipartisan consensus.
Yes.
Because there was no disagreement between Democrats and Republicans going through the Clinton years into
Maybe
the Bush
a few
years.
labour unions and people like Pat Buchanan, but they were a minority voice.
They were entirely marginal. I mean, I remember when I first was working in the US, 2004, asking where are the protectionist candidates, because it was already obvious in 2004 that manufacturing industry was being eviscerated in the American heartland. There were no protectionist candidates. There was no protectionist figure in American politics until Donald Trump walked down the escalator in 2015 and said he was running for president.
How much credit do you give Trump for overturning that orthodoxy on China policy?
Massive credit. He changed American strategy on China single-handedly. If it hadn't been for Trump's disruption of the American political elite, the Obama administration, and presumably the Clinton administration, if she had won in 2016, would have just carried on allowing China to gain on the United States in terms of GDP until finally it had overtaken it.
Yeah.
Trump changed everything. Trump said, no, we're having a new national security strategy. My good friend H.R. McMaster helped write it with Nadia Shadlow. It's a paradigm-shifting document that changes American strategy, not only towards China, but also towards Russia. And people forget this. The national security strategy of the Trump administration defines China and Russia as major strategic competitors, and Iran and North Korea as the other bad guys in the international system.
The national security strategy may have been justified, but as an economic liberal like we at CIS are, doesn't it trouble you that Donald Trump is keen on having a trade war, increased tariffs on China? Why are tariffs a good thing for economic liberals?
Well, I think Robert Lighthizer has made the case very persuasively that you can do free trade with other free traders. But China was not pursuing a policy of free trade. On the contrary, because it was violating its World Trade Organization obligations, it was in breach of the rules of free trade. China had a Made in China 2025 strategy, which was to subsidize domestic manufacturing. It was engaged in wholesale intellectual property rights theft. It was time to turn the tables on China. That's not a violation of Adam Smith's principles. That's smart bargaining in an international system in which one side is not playing by the rules of free trade. So I think Trump did the right thing. And the tariffs, interestingly enough, were highly disruptive of China's economic game plan, really derailed China's growth without costing American consumers the amounts of money that Trump's critics kept saying they were going to have to pay.
Talking about Trump's critics, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, to which you've contributed many articles over many years, they would argue that the tariffs will just backfire on businesses back home in America, and they'll have to pass the costs on to consumers. You'll have to pay higher prices for textiles, clothing, footwear and cars, and, not cars, but electric vehicles at least.
Well, as Donald Trump said to the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, John Micklethwaite, you were wrong and the Wall Street Journal were wrong, and Trump is right, because the inflation that was promised, but just let me finish, Tom, the inflation that was supposed to happen because of the tariffs is nowhere to be seen in the data. Inflation came later under Joe Biden because of the wild fiscal policy of 2021 and the Federal Reserve's incredible being asleep at the wheel that year.
Neil, how do you reconcile your economic liberalism with your sympathies for Trump's tariffs?
The tariffs are the correct bargaining strategy when you're dealing with a superpower, China, that is itself highly protectionist and engaged in all kinds of subsidies that completely rig the international game. China doesn't do free trade. How many times do we have to say this? And if you're dealing with a power of China's size, the second largest economy in the world, and it's not playing by the rules, it's crazy to play by the rules yourselves.
One of the other orthodoxies over the last 30, 35 years in the post-Cold War era has been globalization, economic interdependency, free trade, and certainly from an Australian perspective, we have benefited enormously by slashing tariff protection in the 70s and especially in the 1980s. It helped, along with a lot of other free market reforms, make Australia more competitive. We had a 30-year bull run until the COVID pandemic. So we've benefited enormously from globalisation. But globalisation and free trade, they're dirty words now in the United States.
Well, you can't be surprised by that, since the benefits of globalisation in the United States went to the 0.1% of the income distribution. The median household in the United States, the average household in inflation-adjusted terms, was no better off in 2016 than it had been in 1999. The benefits of globalization were not felt in the American heartland. So the backlash was predictable. I remember writing in 2015, there's going to be a backlash. Trump is the only person who's articulating a response to this, and in due course it has come. Now, Australia had a great run, as you say, but in many ways that was the interwar period. The interwar period between Cold War I, when the Soviet Union was the major threat, and Cold War II, when China is the major threat. And you can't expect to carry on playing the game that you've played when China is not only a major trading partner, a major destination for Australian exports, but is also the principal threat to your national security.
Your critics in America, both liberal and conservative, would say that the displacement of the working class in the United States has been driven not by tariff cuts or free trade or globalisation. It's more to do with technological change. And this is a convenient scapegoat to blame trade for Trump. How would you respond to them?
Well, it's not correct to say that the loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States is purely the result of technological change. That's part of it, but the China shock is measurable, and there's extremely compelling research showing that those counties that were most exposed to Chinese competition saw the most destruction of manufacturing jobs.
Yes, and on that issue, your sparring partner at Concilium at the Gold Coast, John Judas, would agree. Challenging orthodoxies is always healthy. Neil, it's always great to have you at CIS.
It's great to be back, Tom.
Good on you, mate.